Mr. President, the governor of the great state of Texas, Greg Abbott, has made a request to the United States Congress to reimburse our state for the expenses we've incurred in attempting to combat the Texas-Mexico border security crisis during the 4 years of the Biden administration. I'm proud to support this request along with my colleague Senator Cruz and members of the Texas delegation in the House of Representatives. Securing the nation's borders is the responsibility of the federal government, plain and simple. Given the division of responsibilities between the states and the federal government, there's no doubt but that this is a federal responsibility. For 4 years, though, President Biden and Vice President Harris and Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas intentionally and willfully refused to enforce the laws on the books to keep the border secure and to keep our nation safe. Even before his first day in the office, President Biden rolled out the welcome mat to illegal immigrants in speeches during his campaign, inviting what ensued. Early in his presidency, President Biden ended President Trump's very effective policy known as Remain in Mexico. This very simply provided that those who sought asylum needed to remain outside of the borders of the United States while their asylum claim was litigated and ultimately decided, knowing that only about 15% of people who claim asylum ultimately are awarded that by an immigration court. The Biden administration ended construction of President Trump's border wall and instead spent federal funds to store those materials that had already been paid for, squandering taxpayer dollars in the process. And as this crisis was evolving and worsening, President Biden ended Title 42 authorities, the COVID-era policy that was the last string in place helping to keep the lid on the illegal immigration crisis. So not only did the Biden administration turn a blind eye to what was an international responsibility and thus a federal government responsibility, they went a step further and actually actively enacted policies to make it worse. The Department of Homeland Security invited more illegal immigration when it created an app for your phone called the CBP-1 app, Customs and Border Protection app, which allowed migrants to literally schedule an appointment at a port of entry in order to illegally enter the United States. And of course, even if those who did not claim asylum were simply paroled or released into the interior along with a work permit. So here again, there was no matter of deterrence in saying, well, if you want to enter the United States, you need to do so according to the rules in an orderly basis. Essentially, all the rules were set aside and the big green light and a welcome mat was laid out for anybody and everybody who wanted to come, and come they did. Tens of millions of people, we really don't know exactly how many, took advantage of this open border policy by the Biden administration. Let's say 10 million in round numbers. We know about 1.7 million people were gotaways, which is what the Border Patrol calls those who are evading law enforcement, who presumably are up to no good because they know they can't enter otherwise because they have either a criminal record or they're transporting drugs or engaged in some other illicit activity. At the same time that the Biden administration laid out the welcome mat to anybody and everybody who wanted to come to the United States across our border, they issued hundreds of millions of dollars in reimbursements to nonprofits and non-governmental organizations that helped facilitate this illegal immigration through FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program. So instead of meeting their responsibilities to secure the border, they essentially funded those organizations that facilitated it. Vice President Harris was assigned the task, as we know, of being the border czar to help manage this crisis, but she failed to even understand the assignment and failed utterly in completing that assignment. She visited the Texas-Mexico border once in sort of what I would call a drive-by during the 4 years that President Biden and Vice President Harris were in office. It's safe to say she had no concept or clue about what conditions were like on the border and how dangerous this open border policy was. But clearly she didn't care and was unwilling to do anything about it. On her one and only visit to the Texas border, she steered clear of the hot spots like the Rio Grande Valley, which is at the very epicenter of the border crisis at the time. Instead, she went to El Paso for a sanitized, made-for-TV visit. Different parts of the border are very different. And instead of going to the place where she knew the action would be, she went to a place that was relatively calm and sedate. But she did it for a TV hit and no other reason. In 2024, when the Democratic Party deposed President Biden as their nominee and coronated Vice President Harris as their presidential candidate, she suddenly found herself campaigning to be President of the United States. But she actually shirked from the responsibilities that President Biden had given her as the border czar and claimed that she never was actually tasked to oversee the migration crisis. Suffice it to say that the Biden administration's handling of border security was an unmitigated disaster. As a consequence, the state of Texas, which has 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, was basically left up to its own devices. We had no choice but to pick up the slack to try to secure some semblance of basic safety for Texans and the rest of the country. Everything the state of Texas did to fill the gap inured not just to the benefit of the 31 million people who live in Texas, but to the entire nation. Governor Abbott initiated something called Operation Lone Star, which resulted in the apprehension of more than 500,000 illegal immigrants by Texas law enforcement. Thanks to Operation Lone Star, law enforcement arrested more than 50,000 criminals trying to make their way across the border. Texas also built 240 miles of border barriers when the federal government refused to do its job. And officers across the country have seized more than 500 million deadly doses of fentanyl, which is the number one cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45 in this country. As a result of Operation Lone Star, without any help at all from the federal government, Texas was able to reduce illegal immigration into the state by 87%. Unfortunately, the state had to spend nearly $4.8 billion, again, on money that should have been provided by the federal government. Texas taxpayers had to foot the bill for $4.8 billion on walls and barriers, local grants to counties and cities, processing criminal arrests, and moving migrants out of small Texas towns. The state also spent $3.6 billion to deploy the National Guard for building border barriers, guarding and constructing those barriers, and assisting Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection. Another $2.25 billion has gone toward personnel costs for Texas state troopers, law enforcement, who were responsible for repelling additional illegal immigrants, arresting those who were committing crimes, as well as transnational gang members, cartel members, human smugglers, and human traffickers. But this was just the start. There were costs associated with the prosecution of border crimes at Operation Lone Star's criminal processing centers. State game wardens had to pitch in to help patrol the Rio Grande River on the border to help prevent illegal entries. And criminal processing centers required health and safety services. We're all familiar with the saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch, but President Biden and Vice President Harris failed to pony up for 4 years and then asked Texans to pick up the tab for their bill. All told, Governor Abbott and the state legislature had to spend more than $11 billion to make up for the Biden administration's blunders and malfeasance and nonfeasance when it came to border security and immigration. So it's not particularly complicated. Securing a country's borders is the function of the federal government. $11 billion is no small amount of money for a state, particularly one that doesn't have an income tax, to provide that benefits the rest of the country. But this is no different than when the federal government steps in to help states who have to deal with extraordinary expenses during the wake of a natural disaster, as they did for Texas in the case of Hurricane Harvey. But instead of a natural disaster, what we had during the 4 years of the Biden administration was a man-made disaster. While every state became a border state during the last administration, there are costs that Texas had to shoulder that our neighbors have not. It's just fair and right and just for Texas taxpayers to be made whole for the border security responsibilities it took on as a result of President Biden's dereliction of duty. So I'm proud to support Governor Abbott's request for the state to be reimbursed. My colleagues on the House and Senate Appropriations Committees should expect me and Senator Cruz and the entire Texas delegation to be strongly advocating for reimbursement for Texas in the coming weeks. And I look forward to working with them in order to make this a reality. Mr. President, I yield the floor.